Please, floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon. My name is DeJuan Collins, and I'm an impacted parent and a member of Parents Legislative Action Network. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here today to be a voice for the voiceless. My son Isaiah was born January 3rd, 2007. I found out he was my son when he was just a few months old, thanks to a paternity test. At that point, he was already in the system because he was born with a positive toxicology screen for cocaine. I went through the whole process of getting him back, establishing my paternity and everything, to gathering an order affiliation. Once I got custody of my son, ACS tried to make me take a urine test. I was confused because I had just got my son back and had done nothing wrong. There was no reason that ACS should be asking me for a drug test, but the caseworker bullied me, was disrespectful and pushy, and no one told me my rights. Luckily, at that time, I knew Joyce McMillan from CWOP, the parent advocate who informed me of my rights. I was able to tell ACS that they cannot force me to undergo a drug test without a court order. But they seemed determined to harass me. I was arrested later that year on unrelated charges. At that time, my son was safe at home with his grandmother, who cared for him often as a registered nurse. After I was arrested, a caseworker came to my home and took my son from his grandmother under the guise of an emergency removal. Even though he had relatives willing and able to care for him, they put him in foster care with a stranger. I didn't know anything about family law, but I wanted to know what the emergency was that made it so important that ACS took my son out of my house. I had to fight to get the transcripts from my attorney, and when I did, there was no evidence of what the emergency was to allow the emergency to have been undertaken. The emergency removal was illegal. While I was incarcerated, I did everything I could to make sure my son was okay. I was the one asking about his health, his education, his speech therapy, etc. Even my CHIP caseworker testified that I did everything an incarcerated father could possibly do and set the bar high for other dads in prison. At the same time, my mom and my sister were fighting to bring Isaiah home from foster care from New York to Chicago. As I said, my mom is a registered nurse, and she had a good relationship with my son. She and my sister did everything they could to become kin gap guardians. They met all the necessary requirements, gave fingerprints, and had their home inspected and improved. They even had his room ready with a little magnet alpha board that said, "Welcome home, Isaiah," and bought a bunch of toys. Everything was set up for his arrival, but it never happened. The agency failed to submit paperwork to the judge. The toys are still sitting in the garage at this point. Despite my efforts to stay connected to my son and my mom and sister's efforts to become his guardians while I was in prison, ACS changed the goal of my case from reunification straight to adoption. There was no plan for placement of a willing and fit relative, which should have been the next alternative. A judge terminated my parental rights because I failed to provide an adoptive resource for my son while I was incarcerated. But this was the agency's role. I did everything I was required to do, but the agency was required to assist and plan with me, and they didn't do that. The agency didn't cooperate with me, but instead, in 2 letters that I received while I was in prison, the caseworker told me that due to my incarceration, I cannot plan for my son. Therefore, the birth mom is the primary resource planner, and to this date has been non-compliant with her service plan. The agency is seeking a goal change from return to parent straight to adoption. The judge blamed me for failing to fulfill this requirement and terminated my rights to my son. 14 years later, in May of this year, through the grace of God and through my own efforts, I was able to see my son again for the first time. His adoptive parent allowed me a 3.5-hour visit. It's the only time I've seen him since my parental rights were terminated in 2016. And I let him know I have been fighting for him and loving him ever since. 14 years later, the toys my mom bought for him are still in the garage. So I need the assembly to know that we need reform and we need accountability. There are people who got promoted behind my case after all of this. The judge who removed my son is now the head judge. I would love to see the attorneys, judges, and caseworkers who do this to families come under scrutiny. I had a court-appointed attorney in my case, but he failed to adequately represent me. He didn't even inform me of my right to appeal my son's removal order, let alone the placement orders that extended my son's placement in foster care. So I lost the right to appeal those. There were other decisions made throughout my case that I now know I could have appealed, but I only found this out after the fact. The state needs to provide more support for defender services like the Bronx Defenders, the Brooklyn Defenders, that have parent advocates and wraparound support. And parents need to be told what their rights are when they interact with ACS. I was lucky to have Joyce tell me what my rights were, but no caseworker did that. They tried to bully me into doing what they wanted, and they failed to follow through on planning that could have enabled me to keep my son. The systems look to us as criminals, but we need to start looking at them as criminals. Until the law cuts both ways, there can never be justice.
All right, thank you, Mr. Collins. I appreciate it. Let me ask you a question, because there's a couple things about, first of all, thank you for sharing. That's going to be very difficult for everybody who's sharing today. I really appreciate it. The adoptive resource, could you tell me about that? That they said you weren't able to provide a resource for your, because I think that tips into another issue and legislation, but if you could tell me about that a little bit.
Well, when I was in prison, I received 2 letters from the planning agency, and they told me that due to my incarceration, I cannot plan for my son. Therefore, the birth mom...
Hold on, even after you're out?
Period.
You can't plan because you're in prison. What if I'm out in 2 days?
Well, it didn't even matter, because when I did come home, they still didn't plan with me. The only thing my attorneys kept telling me was to surrender my parental rights. They encouraged me to get a 1-bedroom apartment, and I did that. Then the next thing that came out my attorney's mouth was, you need to surrender your parental rights. Surrendering my parental rights and adoption were the only 2 things that was ever offered me.
Okay, let me step back, and I'll talk about the surrendering rights in a second. So you're telling me that the impetus for you losing the kid, your son, was that you didn't pay?
That I didn't plan.
That you didn't plan. But when you tried to plan, they wouldn't let you plan because you're in prison.
Right.
Is there a regulation or a law that they can say that that's allowed? That shouldn't be allowed.
Well, the controlling case, if I can remember, there's a New York Court of Appeals case. I can't remember off the tip of my tongue. But they were supposed to fulfill diligent efforts to me.
Yeah.
And one of those diligent efforts that they was required to fulfill was to assist an incarcerated parent with planning for the future of my son.
I agree, and they should be doing that, but it's beyond that. There should be, and we should talk about this, I'm talking to my lawyer friends here, there may need to be a statute or a regulation that says you cannot deny somebody the ability to plan for taking care of their kids just because they're incarcerated.
But there's already a Court of Appeals case on that.
Yeah, but I want to do law. I appreciate the courts, but I'm the legislature. I got to pass laws, my friend. So yeah, I think that's something we should look into, but that's an outrage in and of itself. Again, so what we're looking for, and thank you for the testimony, what we're looking for is ways that the system drives a wedge or goes to separate families from kids. That's what I'm trying to avoid at all costs. So I really appreciate that. That's very helpful.
Well, I think that the issue, even with me being in prison, the agency was responsible for placing my son with a willing and fit relative. And my mom, which is my son's grandmother, came forth in the beginning. And she had gone through everything they told her to do. The judge ordered an expedited ICPC. The state of New York agreed to pay for the placement of my son in Chicago, but the planning agency didn't submit the paperwork for placement for a willing and fit relative.
Okay. We should probably talk after offline about this, but that was really helpful, Mr. Collins. I appreciate it. Do you have any questions? No?
I don't right now.
Okay.
I do have some questions myself when I get back to my office about looking up laws in this area.
Yeah.
Because some of this is contrary to my understanding of the process. But if my memory is correct and you're with that experience, then I agree with the chair that that's a dramatic issue.
The Court of Appeals case that just came to mind is the matter of Sheila G.
Okay.
Right.
You have a memory like mine.
Yeah, it comes and goes when it wants to.
I'm with you.
And there's also a social service law 384 section -B.
You're a very dangerous man.
Of what their due diligence is.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. That's great. Also, just to two of your points before I move on, if I can. I hear you about the money for the Bronx Defenders and the Brooklyn Defenders. I get that. I appreciate that. We already talked about assisting parents get right to counsel. And then the change of goal from, reunification to, surrendering your parental rights. We're going to, not online, but we're going to have to talk more about that, because that shouldn't be something that happens quickly. That should be a last resort. Okay, Mr. Collins, thank you for your help. I appreciate it.
Chairman.